Welcome back to this episode of the Whiteboard Series of MSP Insider, and today we're going to be tackling one of the most underestimated threats to your MSP business. That is insufficient security documentation. Now, this topic came up on my interview with Matt Lee pretty extensively, and you can go watch that episode if you'd like. It was episode 4 on the show, but I'm really going to take one specific point that he made and unpack it as you've come to figure out from these Whiteboard Series videos. And what we're going to unpack today is Matt Lee's, well, what I'm calling it at least, Matt Lee's proof chain for a documentation system. Now, this whole concept actually came from episode 4 of the show, but I'm just going to take one very specific thing that Matt talked about in the episode and break it down in a whiteboard for you because it's worth spending 20 minutes of time to really unpack and really understand it. So the thing that we're going to unpack today is Matt Lee's proof chain documentation system. Now, why does this even matter? Consider this scenario. A client that you've managed for years, right, actually experiences a security incident, and they blame you, the MSP, claiming that you failed to implement the promised security controls. Now, you know you did everything right, but can you prove it with documentation, with the receipts from years ago, right? 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago? That is ultimately the point that Matt was making, and that is the thing that we have to fix as an industry and as an MSP ourselves. Let's dive straight in.
So I'm surmising that what most MSPs are not aware of is that they have to not only deal with the fact that there is more compliance coming, there's more regulation coming, there's more contractual obligation coming, there's more these things. At the same time, you could get executed for what happened yesterday. You've been selling this to people with the expectations that you're managing it or not. And it goes back to your point, Jeffrey.
Now, for most MSPs, the answer is clearly no. And the gap between what you did and what you can actually prove that you did represents an existential threat to your business. And that is ultimately what Matt was sounding the alarm on. In our interview, Matt Lee, former MSP owner and now Senior Director of Security and Compliance at Pax8, shared his critical insight that every MSP needs to understand. If you can't prove it, then you didn't do it, right? It's even standing out right here on the screen in big bold orange letters. Like, if you cannot prove it, then you didn't do it. And I really want you to sit with that comment for a minute, because I can tell you from all those years, 18, that I was inside 5 different MSPs 7 different times, this was one of those things that we would often reflect on. Is like, we knew that we were doing a good job, but when you really started unpacking all those things, you would always find the moments that really make you want to slam your head against the conference room table, where it's like, you got to be kidding me, right? We missed what? Think about the last tool deployment that you rolled out. And I'm talking about, just pick the last one. Doesn't even have to be the best or the worst. Just pick the last one and think it through, right? When it really came down to, well, what does operationalizing the tool rollout look like? Well, maybe you deployed it to half your base, 30% of your base, 70% of your base, but like that gap in between, the part that never got touched, like that's the part that's really going to start to come back and bite your company, your MSP, in the ass. That is one of the gaps that Matt was trying to get his point across on in the full episode. So today what we're going to do is we're going to break down what I call the proof chain documentation system, which is sort of what I labeled it off of going back and watching this area of the conversation with Matt. And it's a methodology that could literally save your MSP from going out of business when faced with client litigation, insurance disputes, or regulatory investigations. Like, all of this is possible, especially in today's world. So let's dive in. The proof chain is a systematic approach to creating, preserving, and accessing evidence of your security implementations across time. It's built on a simple but powerful principle. We take a look right here. We have it broken down, as you can see. Implementing security controls is only half the job. Documenting that implementation in a way that can be proven years down the road, that is equally as critical, which is why we've put it in the time illustration here, right? The chain itself, drawn out here in front of you, is designed in such a way to actually get you to think about 7 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 2 years down the road, and know what is it that you're doing every single day in the business now that you're going to have to atone for and account for should something go wrong. Now, we hope that it doesn't, but as you'll find out later on in the conversation, like, the reality has changed, and you can now be found and held responsible and accountable, culpable for things that happened in the past. So now's the time to future-proof yourself from that.
And to your point, getting on that proof conversation, I think that is the execution that is coming to most MSPs in the next 5 years. I think most of you that are dead, you won't hear me then because you'll be dead, but most of you that die in the next 5 years will die because you can't document and you can't prove. It's one of those things where we've set it to as MSPs, as operational leaders for years. If it's not in the ticket notes.
Yeah, didn't happen. Okay, so the chain really has 4 primary components to it. First, you have the documentation creation, right? So this is really where we're talking about what do you document and how exactly do you document it. The second one is where do you store it, right? Where and how is this documentation stored? To what degree? To what extent? Who has access? How is it tracked? How is it logged? What's the chain of custody? All those things matter. Third is really what we're talking about, immutability mechanisms, right? Where how you actually ensure the documentation can't be altered once it's there, maintaining the integrity of the information as that point in time, right? Like your little message in a bottle from history. And then last is ultimately the evidence, the accessibility planning. You know, how do you access documentation when you actually need it? Because by the time you're needing to go to it, which is why it's called evidence in this category, it's evidence at this point, right? It's information that you actually need to produce and need to use to validate or provide context around something that happened in the past. Let's dive into this a little bit further inside the categories, though. So if we really come over here first and we take this off, what we're talking about when we're looking at this is documentation, right? So the creation of documentation, again, is only the where it begins. Like that's what we need to be doing today because today is now, but we need to be doing it in such a way that we can reflect back on the current time and our every action that we took so that we can definitively prove that we did the thing, right? So we need to go through this process fairly systematically. It's what to document. This is the specific elements that must actually be recorded. Now, much like a lot of the things that we unpack here, like this is deep thinking work before you can actually get to the doing work, right? So you really need to sit and think intentionally and specifically around these elements of what is it that you need to be documenting, and then establish a standard from it, right? So documentation standards, the format and the level of detail required. Think about this maybe no differently than you might look at your ticket time entry or the documentation as a whole for your business. Odds are if you pulled whatever, a sampling of 5 tickets out of your PSA from 5 different people, you know that the quality of the documentation or the information that's going to be kept there is a little bit different because it's subjective to who did it. That's what you need standards for. So everyone documents and creates this information up to the standard so that it's uniform and you don't end up looking back and hating the fact that you let your worst document person handle this part of the job 7 years from now when you needed it. Another thing that was important when it came to documentation that Matt hit on was the triggers, right? When is documentation created? When and where is it created? How is it created? Where is it placed and when, right? So it kind of goes back to process, but ultimately it's the trigger component. Like when is the moment in time that says, yep, we need to supply some documentation for this to future-proof ourselves, right? And then lastly on the documentation was really about the responsibility. Who's ultimately responsible for creating it, for managing it, for curating it, for putting that stamp of approval on it before it goes away into the system. So let's talk a little bit about diving a little bit deeper at the very first one, right? So when we talked about documentation, it's like, let's start with what is it that we're trying to document. So for each security control, for each piece of evidence that you need to create, you need to go through it with what are the initial implementations? When and how did the control, when was it actually deployed? And how was it actually deployed? And to what extent was it deployed? What other parameters do we need to wrap up and document around its deployment? What was the configuration details, right? Is there a specific settings? Were there certain parameters? Were there certain things that we did a management exception or exclusion to? You need to make sure that those things are documented and signed off on and kept in the same place. What was the scope of coverage, which is probably one of the bigger variables, right? Like, was it just the systems? Was it the users? Was it the data? Like what was protected and how did we go about protecting it with this particular initiative? And then finally, testing the validation, right? Like proof that the control actually works as intended. And not like one of those wonderful Microsoft error messages where it says working as intended, but like really, what was the control? What was the intent? How and why did we put it out there? And is it doing what was intended or is it way off the range?
If you can't prove you did it, it didn't happen. And it comes down to we didn't approach it that way. We might have approached let's make sure that SentinelOne's on every machine, but did we approach being able to prove that in 5 years? Do we pull reports and put them in a folder annually or monthly to be able to show that later if we needed it? Do we do documentation as methodologies to prove we're doing what we say we're going to do? No, probably not. Most of you are not.
So let's move to the second category, which was storage, right? So the second component was this robust storage strategy that ensures documentation survives over time. Going back to the very first illustration, this whole thing has to survive time. So let's break that down a bit, right? So it needs to be a centralized repository. Why? Because a single source of truth for all security documentation is a hell of a lot better than having it disparate or shoved all over the place, right? We're trying to build a system that is going to protect and insulate the business from years to come, so it needs to be in a central spot. Now, it needs to be redundant, so that you have multiple copies in different locations to survive something terrible happening in the business as well. You really need to be thinking through the longevity planning, right? Ensuring that documentation outlasts the technology changes, right? Because you can't tell me as an MSP that certain things don't change way too fast and way too often. Your stack particularly, right? So you need to be thinking through this linear and contiguous train of thought so that you can always go back and prove where things were at that point in time. Access controls, right? Protections against unwanted authorized access, right? Or unauthorized access, actually. Because the data, the breadcrumb trail that you're building is only going to be as valid as the integrity of its sitting there, right? Like think from a criminal justice background, think chain of custody specific to actual evidence, right? That's how we have to start thinking about our data, is as evidence. Organizational separation, right? Documentation, storage, distinct from client systems, right? They can't be in the same bucket because we really are just building our army of information that shouldn't get mixed up in with the client documentation too. So again, think through where and how you're going to segment and containerize this information. And then lastly, the format considerations, right? So for what kind of file type is actually going to be accessible over time? Is it going to be this flash in the pan new AI tool or widget in a particular file type that isn't going to survive? Or is it going to be a text file, a Word file, a PDF, something like that, that will sustain and survive, 10 years worth of technology evolution? And when you think about documentation storage and diving in a little bit deeper there, one of the biggest mistakes MSPs make is actually storing client security documentation exclusively in client systems. But what actually happens then when those systems are the ones that get corrupt or compromised? Well, then you lose not only the client, but you lose your proof too. So that's why you want to separate these things and keep it completely disparate from that. So recap documentation real quick. It needs to be independent of client systems. It needs to be protected from modification, and it needs to be accessible even after the client relationship ends. You also need to preserve this documentation for the appropriate duration and the potential liability that you're up against. Oftentimes that's 7 years, but not always. So you need to ensure that you're protecting and setting yourself up for protection through the long haul, right? And so understand what that statute of limitations is first, and then reverse engineer your design from there. So the third major component in the system design was immutability mechanisms, right? So when we think about that, we need to think about this third section is when you're establishing immutability, that means you're ensuring that documentation cannot be altered after it was created, right? This is critical because documentation created or modified after an incident will just be viewed as suspicion and won't actually, it's not going to strengthen your case by any means, right? In some cases, that's probably going to weaken it because it looks like you're going back to doctor the evidence.
If you look at the Travelers lawsuit, that was one of the only examples of a rescission of insurance for our space. Was Travelers sued a company after 2 years later in 2022 from a 2020 incident, if I remember correctly, and said, hey, you didn't have MFA like you said you did in your application. We want to take the money we paid you back and give you your premiums back as if you never bought this policy. Here's your $4,000. Hand me my $3 million, please. Right? 2 years later. Well, now you have to be able to prove it.
So how do we ensure the integrity of the data so that we don't have to worry about this? Well, one of the things is timestamping. You need to have cryptographic proof when documentation was actually created. You need to be able to track the changes that happened with immutable history, right? So that you can guarantee that it hasn't been touched since it was created, or if it was, it's timestamped appropriately and for what reasons. You also need cryptographic validation of documentation authenticity, right? That it was created when we said it was, how we said it was, from what system we said it was, so that can't be argued as well. And then you also need to ensure that the media or the systems prevent the modification, right? Like not only is it good enough to have the policy there, but you set yourself up one step further by ensuring that the technology that's housing it actually doesn't allow that as well. And then you've got things like mathematical verification, right? That content hasn't actually changed within it. And lastly, as I mentioned before, you've got really chain of custody, right? Records of who actually had access and who did access the documentation at that point over the whole course of history. Now remember, we're talking, it's not just like last week or last month or last fiscal year. We're talking Let's just use 7 years as a rule of thumb, although it might be longer. That's the kind of longevity and life cycle, lifespan that you need to be thinking about with everything that goes into it today. Now, immutability doesn't always require advanced technology, even like simple approaches like regular exports to PDF with timestamps or periodic emails to a dedicated mailbox with attachments. How about printed copies with signatures and dates filed away safely and securely? Third-party attestation services are a good option too. I actually think about this in a similar way. I used to call it like the poor man's trademark or the poor man's patent, something like that. It was all the information inside a certified envelope to yourself with return receipt or whatever. It's kind of a similar concept, right? Anything that you do to put yourself further down this path of being able to prove anything is going to be so much better than being able to say, well, I know that we did it, right? I know we did it because John on tier 3 is just the best knock technician we ever had and he never missed anything. That's not going to surpass or pass anything. It's not going to validate anything. So even just take your baby incremental steps, right? Maybe you don't turn it into this huge, scary process or project that you have to undergo for the next year. Start small. Start tactically, start tangibly, but do something. You can't not take this seriously, as Matt talked about in the full episode. So the key to ensuring that there's no way documentation could have been created or modified after the fact is basically the key takeaway that I want you to have as it relates to storing the information. Now, the fourth component is accessibility planning. When what we want is to ensure that you can find and access the specific documentation when it's needed, potentially years after creation. Now, there's different ways to accomplish this, right? Some of those include indexing systems, right? What methods for categorizing and tagging the documentation do you need to put in? Maybe it's search capabilities. What tools for finding specific documentation do you need to ensure the platform has? Retrieval processes, procedures for accessing archived information so that it's done a specific way and all the boxes are checked every single time. Access rights, right? Defining who has access to historical information could be incredibly helpful. Also, to just keep the chain as clean as possible as time goes on. Contextual relationships. Are there connections between this piece of information and that piece of information? Maybe it was for the client. Maybe it was for the system. Maybe it was for an application that many clients used, right? Like, how can you build those relationships amongst the data so that when you need to go find it, you're finding the best information simplest? And then lastly, interpretation guidance, right? Information that actually helps explain the documentation context, because again, this thing's going to be happening over the course of time. What's going to happen over time? You might have changed out your entire team and you're the only common denominator that's still there with the business back when it was done the first time. So you need to be thinking about, how do we explain this as if a third party could pick it up and understand not only how to use it, how to access it, how to interpret it as well is critically important. So one of the most common failures is actually creating documentation that becomes impossible to find later, right? It's in some ways, think about it as like the creation or the origination of Google when the internet first blew up, right? This endless sea of information that wasn't managed by anyone, and there was no great Dewey Decimal System to go find the information you wanted when you needed. So let's talk some real world, right? Because Matt wasn't just preaching that like the doom was imminent. He was giving clear examples of where and why and how this is actually happening in our industry now, and why it's so freaking important that we need to understand this completely and start implementing change in our MSPs today.
And I would imagine the reason that settled out of court very quickly was they couldn't prove it. So I'm surmising that what most MSPs are not aware of is that they have to not only deal with the fact that there is more compliance coming, there's more regulation coming, there's more contractual obligation coming, there's more these things. At the same time, you could get executed for what happened yesterday.
So in the Travelers case, a company suffered a breach and made an insurance claim, right? Travelers initially paid out millions of dollars, but then later sued and recovered the money when they discovered that the company couldn't prove that they actually had MFA in place, despite claiming they did in their insurance application. This case highlights several critical points, which is the whole purpose behind even doing any of this stuff, right? They need proof that extends years in the past, right? This was the part that really got me when I was talking to Matt in the conversation. It's like, we need to be doing things totally different today so that 7 years from now, I can go back with 100% certainty and be able to prove everything that we said we were doing in the MSA or in the contract and the agreement and the quote. Documentation must align precisely with what you've actually claimed elsewhere, right? We can't just pencil whip these agreements anymore for people, even if they're giving them to you to pencil whip. Like, now's the time to have the really uncomfortable conversations with Mr. or Mrs. Client and say, hey, we can't pencil whip this. We're now culpable. Or we have maybe it's even a fiduciary responsibility at this point, right? To not just pencil whip this stuff. So here's the solutions that we need to put in place for your business if you want this kind of coverage under this kind of policy with this particular carrier. The burden of proof is on us now. That's the thing that I think in the conversation with Matt, he was trying to get across so strongly was like, you can't just pencil whip this stuff and say, well, my client will deal with it, right? They're going to be the one left with the bag. Like, no, we as MSPs are now getting entangled in that whole hot mess, and we need to do better from day one so that we can survive the situations that we might get pulled into later. So financial consequences of the documentation failure can actually be catastrophic. In the traveler example, right? It was like $3 million, I think he said. So odds are they probably didn't have that cash on hand laying around years down the road, right? Like, that's the part, again, that really just was perhaps the most eye-opening, was thinking through the lens of time and acknowledging that time always wins. So think about your own clients and their insurance applications, the ones that they've sent you. If challenged to prove that the security controls you claimed were in place 2 years ago, could you actually do it? Let's take a look at these examples, right? So we've kind of covered the first one. So the insurance claims. If an insurer questions whether or not the security controls were in place, could you prove it? What happens when the insurer questions whether or not the controls were ever in place? What happens when the insurer may attempt to deny coverage if you can't prove the implementation was there? Documentation must match exactly what it was that you were claiming in the insurance applications at the time and be provable. As we look at the litigation in the second primary example, right? What happens when a client sues for damages from a security breach? What happens when a client claims that you failed to implement the promised security measures that were in your 90-page contractor agreement or your one-page quote with just some fancy buzzwords, right? You must demonstrate that you met service-level agreements and contracts, period. And you must be able to produce the documentation that says, this is exactly what we delivered and this is exactly what was in the agreement. And let's take a look at that third one, right? Regulatory cases, right? What happens when regulators investigate clients' compliance failure, which is where the MSP starts to get left on the hook? Now, you must be able to prove the controls were implemented as required by the regulations at that time.
If you're not doing that, set those expectations. Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Client, we are simply offering ad hoc anti-malware services to you. We want to let you know that you're going to have an audit as a HIPAA entity. You might now need to be able to present this. We'd love to offer you a new service. We'd love to make our service more valuable than what it was for very simple actions.
In each of these cases, the burden of proof falls on you, your MSP, you. Without a solid proof chain, you face the potential of insurance claim denials, legal judgments, regulatory fines, reputational damage, all of it, right? It's not an exaggeration to say that documentation failures can literally put MSPs out of business. Matt shared a sobering example during our interview.
One of the headlines was, there will be death. I have an MSP that I serve on an ERT, or emergency response team, and they called in with a problem on an incident in their organization last year. They just told me that they're done. Their $2 million MSP has no more clients. They have no more revenue. They have no more employees. They're shutting down. And this person spent $2 million buying this business 2 years ago as a fully functioning company. And they weren't idiots. They looked just like you. Looked like just like you, MSP. Every other MSP hearing me, they look just like you.
This is the reality that is facing MSPs today. A single major security incident combined with an inability to prove due diligence can result in a total loss of client trust, catastrophic legal or financial liability, or a total business failure. The proof chain system isn't just about better documentation. It's about business survival. Now, implementing the proof chain system doesn't happen overnight. Here is a practical approach to how you can get started, how you can get off the X, as I like to say, right? Audit your current documentation. Assess what you are already doing and identify the gaps so you know where to start building out that process or know where to cover those gaps. Establish documentation standards. You need to create templates and procedures to getting this stuff filled out correctly. Implement a centralized storage location, right? Set up your documentation repository. Develop immutability protocols. Establish methods to ensure documentation integrity over time. Right? Create retrieval procedures. So define how documentation is going to be accessed when it's needed, not really if anymore, right? When it's needed. Then you need to train your people, right? Train your team members. Ensure everyone understands their documentation responsibilities. You need to conduct regular testing. Periodically verify that you can produce the required evidence that you're putting this whole system in place for, right? It's just like testing your backups and booting them and making sure that you can actually recover from them. And lastly, integrate workflows. Build documentation into your everyday processes.
I think there's going to be people being sued. I think clients are going to have contractual requirements they can't meet. I think you're going to have a loss of a CMMC client that goes to this other MSP that was $22,000 of your monthly revenue, and they're going to have to go, and you couldn't have gotten your way there, and you can't get there fast enough to keep the business, right? If threat actors don't get you first, the contractual pieces will.
The last step is the most important. Documentation that depends on extra work will always be neglected. It's why we struggle so badly as an MSP to begin with. Your proof chain must become part of your standard operating procedures. They're non-negotiables. They're fireable offenses. They need to be that serious. The proof chain documentation system is not just another administrative burden. It is a critical business protection mechanism. As the security landscape evolves, your ability to prove what you did will become just as important as what you actually did.
And so going all the way back to Alex's question that triggered this is that the misconception is that you can just continue to be ignorant. No, ignorant people die too, ignorantly, right? Like, all right, I'll get off my high horse before I fall and break my neck.
So let's talk immediate action steps, right? The very first thing you need to do is document just one control. Start by creating a comprehensive documentation for just that one security control. Why? Because you can create the template off of it. Number 2, establish that repository. Create that centralized secure location for documentation storage. 3rd, create the process, right? It needs to be repeatable. It has to be a repeatable documentation process that handles all of the future implementations. Then test retrievability. Verify you can find and access documentation when you actually need it. And then lastly, review contracts. Ensure your client agreements accurately reflect what you can prove. And remember, in the words of Matt Lee, if you can't prove you did it, then you didn't do it. Your MSP's survival may depend on the strength of your proof chain. So if you want a copy of this framework, all you have to do is just comment chain here on the page that you're watching this, or maybe check the show notes if it's on the channel, and I will DM you a link to that, or you'll get access to the download link. But you'll get a link to not only the overview document, but a walkthrough of a process hierarchy for you to actually implement this in your MSP. Thank you again for joining the MSP Insider for this additional whiteboard session with Matt Lee, and I will see you next time.